Good afternoon. This is Bob Celeste, and welcome to Open Mic Friday, where we have weekly discussions with interesting people doing interesting things. If you're on the live broadcast, there are two ways you can engage with our guest today. You can either raise your hand on the broadcast, and I'll open up your line, and you can ask questions and interact. Or if you just want to ask a question, you can put it in the questions area, and I'll do my best to convey that question. So today we have a really interesting discussion. We've had someone from the Accord project a few weeks ago talk about the technical aspects of blockchain smart contracts and trying to work with legal contracts. But today we really are privileged to have on our call today Nevena Yevremovich. Nevena, did I mangle that too much for you?
No, that was great. Thank you very much. That was great.
And Nevena is from IACCM, and she also works with the Accord project in the area of dispute resolution. So there's an explicit working group within the Accord project around dispute resolution. I thought it was a really interesting topic in that we start to look at smart contracts and what it means to co-develop applications together and kind of the legal aspects of it and how you need to treat that in that kind of environment. So Nevena, welcome to the program, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be here, and I very much look forward to our discussion in the next hours.
Great. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be part of the Accord project.
Well, the reason why you cannot pronounce my last name that effectively is because I'm from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm based in Sarajevo. I'm a lawyer by background, and I have legal training in both Bosnia, which is a civil law country, and also in the United States, which is a common law country. So during my career, I have had this comparative kind of insight into these two legal systems and traditions, and which was particularly important and fascinating and challenging for me because I was focused on international commercial law and international dispute resolution, primarily arbitration. At the moment, I'm manager of corporate learning with the International Association for Contract and Commercial Management, or IACCM. And just briefly, for those listeners who are not that familiar with IACCM, we are a not-for-profit membership association that supports organizations to achieve world-class standards in their contracting and relationship management processes and skills. We have over 50,000 members. We operate in across 171 countries, and we are proud to have over 19,000 corporations as our members. So we are really leading the way in responding to the demands of global networked markets. With the IACCM, I'm working as part of our learning research and development team, and there I'm focused on developing content and kind of delivery, managing delivery of our learning programs that are focused on contract and commercial management and just broadly kind of professional development in this field. At the same time, as you mentioned, I'm wearing this hat of co-chair of the Accord project dispute resolution working group, where I have the pleasure and honor to work with experts around the globe in both dispute resolution and technology development sector to explore how these new emerging technologies, particularly smart contracts, smart legal contracts and blockchain, can be used in dispute resolution spheres, alternative dispute resolution sector. So I think that would sum up the background.
Great, thanks. So you made a distinction there, smart legal contracts. Is there a reason for that?
Well, the Accord project distinguishes the two smart legal contract from a smart contract. So okay. Smart legal contract would be a legally binding agreement that is digital, and then you are able to connect the terms and performance of these obligations to external sources of data and software systems, whereas smart contract would be a software code that operates through a blockchain. And the dispute resolution working group looks at this kind of broadly, and what we are trying to explore is how we can automate dispute resolution processes, particularly right now alternative dispute resolution processes, and with a focus on arbitration, but also how can we use these new technologies to assist corporations in avoiding disputes or managing that in that pre-dispute phase. I hope this answers your question.
It does, yeah. And so the pre-phase, does that also include when you're actually creating the smart legal contract, the kind of clauses or the kind of things that you would want to make sure that you put into the contract?
Well, yes and no. So when you look at a contract and it's in that kind of contract management cycle, parties come in with a certain understanding of the goal that they want to achieve with that contract and trying to accommodate interest from both sides. And of course, not everything always goes smoothly, and there can be certain misunderstandings between the two parties about certain facts or rights and obligations that come out of that or stem out of that contract. Now, before that misunderstanding reaches that level of being a full-blown dispute where parties absolutely cannot agree on how to classify a certain issue and how to resolve it, that's what we think of as a pre-dispute phase. So everything that happens, from the moment that they enter into negotiations till the moment when they cannot, when there's an agreement that they cannot agree on how to resolve a dispute, or just cannot because of the fundamentally different positions that they have at that point.
Okay, so does a smart legal contract in that kind of context, does that provide documentation, or does it actually provide a process or a way out of that dispute?
So what is a great feature in terms of the smart legal contract is that it can, first of all, it can automate. It's digital in its nature, and because it can connect different terms in the contract, and it can connect those terms with performance of those obligations, what can happen is that parties can embed in that smart legal contract features, or a stop sign, if you will, when something does not go as planned, but it is not an issue around which parties have a disagreement, right? So it can be a phone call away from being resolved, and then the performance of the contract can continue. And because it is so automated, that there can be a facilitator, a facilitating feature in that contract that would allow parties to manage that more effectively and resolve it, because it's just not yet a full-blown dispute.
Okay, and when you're talking about the feature, this kind of third party almost, would that actually include a real third party that might interact, that the contract might kick off an interaction with a third party that you two parties have agreed would solve some, or just some of the.
So at that stage, first of all, that's a great question, and the answer at that stage, when we talk about this stop sign or stop kind of check, there is no third party involved yet. What we are actually looking into right now, is with our working group, is how to implement that. What we think of right now conceptually a stop sign, which is essentially, if you look at it, it's a kind of pause period where parties can just it's a phone call away and they can resolve it. And an example of that would be, we've ordered goods that should arrive, and I'm oversimplifying now. We've ordered goods that should arrive at 11:30 in a particular port, but it arrived at 11:45, and that it should not be, ideally, that should not cause a dispute to arise. But because of the way it is coded in a smart legal contract, it will recognize it as a potential non-performance. So in that case, what can be embedded in a smart legal contract would be the stop sign that will allow parties to just resolve it between themselves and not go through a dispute resolution process at that stage, because there's essentially no dispute at that point.
Okay, so that might provide an alert to the parties, and then they can either say, okay, continue. It's within some sort of norm that we're able to accept, or
exactly. That's the idea.
gotcha.
And that is something that the feedback, at least that we are seeing, is that this is particularly important and interesting to corporations. What is also, and what smart legal contracts essentially bring is this really effective way of managing these contracts, or enforcing executing these contracts, because you connect these terms and performances, what you essentially have is a contract that is automated, is self-enforcing, and that is quite an appealing feature. And within that contract, then we start to think, again, coming back to the working group, what we start to think is, how do we embed a dispute resolution clause within such an self enforcing contract, and how would that integration look like? And then what are the layers of automating dispute resolution processes when parties are in fact in a dispute?
Okay, so as you're starting to build the smart legal contract, you're mindful that there could be disputes, and so you're adding in there, as much as you can, ways of managing those, either in an automated way or a less intrusive way than going to court or something larger like that.
Yes. What we try to do is to see, again, explore, because we have to be mindful of the fact that these new technologies are still developing, and they're developing rapidly, and they're expanding to meet different needs. And what, again, the working group we're focused exclusively on the automating dispute resolution processes. Right now, what we are looking into is a set of rules, arbitration rules, that are generally considered as uniform or represent good practice in arbitration, and then seeing how we can, to what extent these rules, so legal norms in that set of rules, how can we code those? How do we create a workflow in that process? And then how do we code that? And how would these clauses in a set of rules that would regulate a particular dispute, how would that work? So at what point, what happens if a party wants to file a claim? What happens when a party wants to file a response for claim? How many days do we want to embed in that workflow? How would those responses, those submissions initially be forwarded or communicated with a tribunal? What happens if parties cannot agree on a particular part of a process, and so forth? What is important to note, again, is that when we say automating dispute resolution processes, we do not mean replacing the decision maker in that, right? The arbitration process in and of itself includes a third neutral party, an arbitrator. It could be a one-person or three-member panel or tribunal, and that is the part that absolutely is crucial and has to remain as such. But everything around managing that process can be automated theoretically, and we're looking into to see to what extent it can be automated and how it will look in practice.
Okay, that makes sense. And what's interesting here is that, in our traditional mindset, where we have a legal contract that we've written up between parties, and then we each go back to our IT departments and say, this is how you implement this in our systems. These are the things that are going to happen. None of what's taking place in those back-end systems really is visible to the other party. They usually do alerts or reports, and then someone does something, calls someone, sends them a letter. But now we're doing this in the open together.
Yes, that is. So designing dispute resolution platforms in this field first and foremost, absolutely fascinating. Right now, the way dispute resolution processes look, they're analog. You still, the vast majority of vast majorities of parties and institutions in this field still communicate, they use emails, and rarely, I think, you can find examples where you would have video conferencing or something along those lines. So practice is still very much, in this physical world, very much analog. So the first why, which makes this entire process within our working group fascinating, is because we are trying to have that shift from this analog to this digital world. So that's quite groundbreaking, if you will. And yes, what we've seen, you have on the market, and I refer to that very often as Wild West. There are examples of, though these are blockchain-based platforms generally, there are platforms that are already either conceptually designed or are being implemented within a particular, very small market or for a particular purpose. And some of the features of these platforms are not something that you would see in your everyday arbitration or your everyday mediation. For example, some of these platforms have a feature that you would rank or grade your arbitrator once he's done, and he's kind of collecting points, and more points that he has, essentially more likely he or she is to be selected as an arbitrator in the next proceedings. That is really something that you cannot really see in arbitration today. So this shift from, as you mentioned, this moving from this physical analog space to this open space where we're all doing it together is quite a transformative change that will require different stakeholders to agree on how that would look like, to make sure that it is efficient, that basic legal standards are respected, that this is something parties will actually want to use, and so forth.
So that's what you just said there about the basic legal standards. We had talked earlier in the week about the different, I don't know what you want to call them, kind of legal constructs, or how different maybe countries, geographies interpret an action. Does this help with that if you reduce some of this down to code, which is understandable? Well, understandable by some people, I guess.
Right. So there is a cultural as well level of this shift, and I guess the best way to answer that question, it would be to look at it from two different perspectives. So first of all, in order for a legal clause in a contract to be coded, there has to be a clear understanding from lawyers and programmers involved what each side wants or needs. So essentially, and that is you can look at it as a communication gap. So lawyers need to know how to talk to programmers, and programmers need to understand where lawyers are coming from. And this is important because of the frame of, the background of both of these areas. So lawyers do not necessarily think in black and white terms. Rather, they think of in broad concepts and trying to define certain instruments and certain concepts that are often vague enough to cover a broad range of circumstances that might arise. And on the other side, programmers are used to thinking in black and white because code is if and then logic, and bridging those two is something that will inevitably, that is happening now, and that will continue to happen, because both sides now need to be educated to be able to communicate for this to happen. So that would be one challenge. And then second challenge, and this is more of a legal challenge, or stemming from legal side, not all countries in the world, legal systems in the world, as you mentioned, have same understandings of same legal concepts, right? Every country is unique because it's, while there are similarities, you have two distinct legal traditions in the world, civil law and common law systems, and they often have fundamentally different understandings in certain things. What this means is that if you have a clause that is coded in, you have a French lawyer talking to a programmer, that clause would look or operate under a different premise than the same clause would in, let's say, United States, because each lawyer will come there with their own background and their own understanding, trying to communicate it to the other side, to their respective programmers, so that they can code it and turn it into something practical and feasible. So there will be a level of challenge in terms of how would coding in a cross-border transaction look like, and whether code, it might be that nothing will change because we will have standard templates or a certain level of standardization, but it might be that because we will now all have to learn this new language, that will help convergence between these two systems. It's really not something that is possible to predict at this point, so we can just have debates about what might come going forward.
I like your example of the two countries, French and U.S., let's say, or any two countries, but each are operating within a certain context that they assume, and,
Yes.
and you don't walk into a room and try to explain your entire life to the other person before you enter into a contract. But the fact that both sides have to kind of translate their context into code, which may be a little bit closer to exposing some premise to the other party, or even to yourself, to say, oh, if I mean this, so I actually need to code it this way, and that may be more understandable to the other side.
I mean, because these different legal systems exist and they operate, doesn't mean that we don't have cross-border trade, and then we don't have cross-border contracts that facilitate these different interests and allow parties to come to a mutual understanding of how they want this to operate. But but at the same time, the fact remains that you still have this distinction, and then how that will be meant, how that translation process, quote unquote, will work is going to be on one side challenging, and then again quite interesting and fascinating, because for you don't have to explain your entire life, obviously, but for a programmer to understand why a particular clause is drafted as is, or what is its underlying purpose and how it will integrate with other contracts, with other clauses in a particular dispute, he needs to understand, or she needs to understand, the underlying purpose of that clause. At least that is kind of how I see it. And then a lawyer needs to explain that or think about it in if and then terms. And what has been quite fascinating for us as well in the working group, coming back from the dispute resolution process, is that we had to think, take a step back and think of an arbitration clause in a digital term. So is it a passive or an active clause? When does it get triggered? What does have to happen in a contract for that clause when it's coded to be triggered, and when it is triggered, what will happen within that contract? So does the contract stop, or do we the self-enforcement? Does it alert the parties that now there's an action on their end that is required? For example, deciding whether they want to file a claim or not, and so forth. So it's quite, we take some of these things for granted, especially in dispute from a dispute resolution perspective, because of this analog feature of it, because this is something that everyone is so used to in that field. And now we're talking about designing that system to operate under a completely different environment, and that forces us as well as lawyers to rethink those particular clauses, to rethink how to design that, how to define that workflow, and how to make sure that system works in and of itself, and that it is integrated with a smart contract so that it actually is operative. And that is, yeah, a challenge.
Interesting. So it sounds like, if as you start to get into this new environment and start to experiencing it, the first thing you might put in there is, just stop. If we get to this
Yeah.
point and this happens, then just stop, alert the parties, and then, the adults will take over, if you will.
Mhm. Yeah, that is definitely, yeah, an option.
Okay.
Definitely.
And then you get into maybe
Mhm,
alerting, and then as we know with smart contracts, you actually may have some action. So there may be some exchange of
mhm.
currency, or something might actually take place as we start to trust this kind of new shared code set, if you will.
Mhm. And yes, I mean, I agree with that, what the novel and kind of appealing thing, at least from my perspective, when we talk about smart contracts and their and enforcing feature, is that if the parties agree that in case of a non-performance or breach, that they do not want to engage in a dispute resolution process, but rather that they will have solutions embedded in a smart contract, they can do that. What I mean by this is that, let's say a seller doesn't deliver, or seller doesn't deliver, buyer doesn't pay for the goods. What smart contract may allow for is an enforcement and just getting funds straight out of their account, or an escrow account, or however they would
Hmm.
want to define that. But what is important there is that they, theoretically that can be possible, and that is quite appealing, because that is how if the parties want to do so, they can. Right. What is on the other side of the coin there is to make sure that that feature is not abused, and because it's so appealing and so easy enforced. And that is again where this dispute resolution as a system of checks and balances comes in that context. I hope this answered your question.
Yeah, it does, and it seems that as we go forward with this, that I think you
Mhm.
mentioned this before, that there may be templated kind of clauses, only
Mhm.
because if you try to create everything from scratch for every contract, um, it could get very onerous.
Yeah, and I like the idea of templates in this sense. When you, and particularly in the context of dispute resolution, what is the way this works right now, and I'm sure your listeners are aware of this. When you want to have an arbitration clause in your contract, usually you incorporate the so-called model clauses, and model clauses are predefined clauses by arbitration institutions around the world, and each is they're all similar and at the same time unique. They're unique because they tie that model clause to a particular institution, for example ICC, but at the same time they're quite similar because they have similar wording, and they provide for similar parts of that. So essentially, that would allow coding or automating those clauses in and of itself quite easy. And that is the kind of benefit of the arbitration world, is more or less everybody agrees what the wording of that is, and what the effect of that clause, the effects of that clause are. And I'm very happy to say that the working group of the Accord project, with the support of the technology group, has managed to code like an arbitration clause, using the Accord project template. And we are now working to see how we can further expand that and make that very, very simple clause at this point more sophisticated, as kind of first step in that process. So it can be done,
Great.
and it's a great step forward. And I think what is a benefit of that is because essentially these model clauses are exist as sort of templates. Um, so automating dispute resolution processes in this context is more manageable, if you will,
Hmm.
from
So
that.
I think what's interesting about this is that as people start to explore blockchain technology and smart
Mm-hmm.
contracts. To think that this is just like what we've always done behind our walls
Mm-hmm.
is probably probably induces a little bit of risk on parties if they're not thinking about having to add these clauses to what they're co-developing with other trading partners maybe.
Um,
I don't know if that was.
no. It does, and yes, there is. I mean, you want to think about how to, if you're looking into how to use blockchain and smart contracts in your everyday business, you need to think about how to integrate dispute resolution clauses in that sense. And it's not, whether it will be the same as, whether blockchain will just, or smart contracts will just help us do the same thing that we are used to doing in more efficient way, I guess there is some level of truth to that, because when you look at the history of how contracts and have been recorded and executed, you start from oral contracts to written contracts, and then you have telefaxes and telegrams, and then email, and now you have blockchain and smart contracts. So there is that technological development that has allowed us to develop the way the contracts are recorded and how they are enforced. But the underlying the essence of contract, like for example, contract for sale of goods, is largely the same, and so you can't really see a lot of difference in that sense. So how blockchain and smart contracts will reshape the way we do business, I think will have more effect in terms of how we manage these contracts and how we manage these contracts, especially through all the contracting cycles, rather than it will have any substantive effect on those rights and obligations that come out of a particular relationship. But again, given that we are still in wild west phase, it wouldn't come as a huge surprise that we might see some changes coming out of that we're not because the novelty of it kind of opens the doors to things that we might not anticipate at this point.
Right, it gives you an excuse to think again, if you will.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
So we have a couple of questions from people that are listening. One a technical question, and then an interesting one on the legal kind of contract side. So I'm going to just bring Denise. Are you on?
Oh,
yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Yes. Hello.
Hey, thank you. Very interesting, Nevena. Thanks for coming on board today. Two questions. First, is the stop sign just a piece of code that is written into the smart contract?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your question. I think it's a great point. Right now, stop sign can be that, but again, so we are now designing how it will work out. Essentially, yes, the idea is that it will be a piece of code that is embedded in a contract and that operates as a stop sign. That is, as a non-programmer, that is what I can give you at the moment as an answer.
Okay,
to that question.
That's actually helpful. So if I'm representing a few firms that have decided that they want to participate in a permission blockchain ecosystem for any type of supply chain, and they want to start with this. Would you recommend that they would first sit down and say, okay, guys, let's start with some of our model clauses that we can all agree on? Would that be a pragmatic place to start?
I would say yes. That is always, it's always good to start from where you agree on and what is in common interest. And I would also, in that sense, warmly recommend that they also look into the dispute resolution clauses that come out, because after you take that off the table, then you can talk about the differences that exist and how to reconcile those in the best in a pragmatic way, as you mentioned.
Got it. Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, Denise. And then Bill had a really kind of interesting discussion here. And Bill, can you hear us?
Yeah, hi. A great topic. I'm Bill Macbeth, and I'm with Chainlink Research. We do supply chain research, and one of the biggest thorns. This is in the universe of retailers and their suppliers, and so it's very common for retailers to have literally hundreds of pages of requirements for how the suppliers are going to serve them. And this is every single detail, like exactly where the labels should be on the carton, how high they can stack pallets, and so forth. And I don't think those are legal contracts in and of themselves, but I'm pretty certain that they're referenced in legal contracts, that you're going to follow all these rules, and we'll lay out penalties each time you send us a carton that either is packed wrong or whatever is wrong with it. You'll get charged this amount of money. So that ends up being, it's not uncommon for suppliers to have more than 5% of their revenue in chargebacks. They're losing 5% of their revenue or having to pay back because of all these chargebacks. So it's a huge area of contention. Usually what happens is when there's something that goes wrong, they'll receive this chargeback like many months later. And it's taken out of, they send an invoice and they send them a payment minus these chargebacks from a few months ago. And that just makes it really hard to figure out what actually happened. And most of the time they'll just accept most of them unless they really have a bunch of evidence to the contrary. So it seems like this would have the ability to potentially help reduce that problem, so that whenever the retailer is going to issue a chargeback, I mean, they should know at the point of execution, they receive those pallets, they look at them, they say, they stack them too high and they're getting crushed. And they should be able to put that right away. And so I'm just wondering, are you looking at this kind of issues that may be like outside of the contract itself, but maybe there's a smart contract that incorporates that whole manual of requirements. So anyway, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you so very much for that, because I think it also brings out some symptomatic issues that happen that are closely connected to moving from, again, this analog to this digital sphere. So to answer your first question, we have not been looking at those types of all of these things that are outside of the contract but are related to it yet. And I appreciate your comment, because it really sheds light into what are the needs, at least of this industry in particular, and we can look into this going forward after we have some basis. What I agree with you that in this industry, what the smart contract or blockchain at least would be quite a useful, could help alleviate some of these issues. But to make additional remark to you and Denise that asked the question earlier, what is important in these processes as you move forward from, again, analog to digital is first of all, contract simplification, because you need to, in order for something to be coded or to be managed, you need to simplify it in a way that you can actually code it. And IICCM has been doing some great work in the field of contract simplification, and especially how you can, present these lengthy contracts, very burdensome contract, into something that is tangible and is a framework of that relationship. And then once you have that, you can then think about how to make it, transform it into this digital sphere. And additionally, and to Denise as well, just to add one more comment, when you sit to negotiate, again, what IICCM is developing at the moment, which I think will be very helpful to you and to your clients as well, is that we have our contracting principles which aim to reflect kind of the common ground between the parties in particular areas. So I invite you to take a look at our website as well, and reach out to if you want to learn more about these initiatives, because I think these are a prerequisite, a pre-step before you start getting into the digitalization of it, or moving to a smart contracts blockchain. Yeah.
As you were talking, I was thinking about kind of the borderline between contract and just operational process. And especially in today's world where companies are much more, they're much more segmented across tiers of the supply chain, but that requires a higher level of integration. So what I mean by that is when the retailers, and it's not just retailers, also big manufacturers, when they create these requirements documents for how their suppliers are going to serve them, what they're really saying is here's how we operate. You know, it's not just arbitrary where they want that label. They've got, you know, 600 foot per minute conveyor belts in their warehouses, and that's where they need to have those in order for that to work. And sort of, you know, on and on. So those are really operational level details that are saying if you're going to be our supplier, then here's how you need to operate so that we work smoothly together and we're not kicking stuff off to the side because it can't be read by our machines. That's just one example. Or the pallets are crushed, so now we have to sort those boxes out. So I guess I'm being a little long-winded here, but what I'm getting to is there's this sort of those manuals which have all these requirements are really a way of specifying operational details, but they are tied because there are actual financial penalties for not meeting those. So yeah, so it does. Your goal of simplification is a great one, but when it comes to operational details, you kind of need all of those to actually make it work. So I'm not sure how that all ties together. Maybe those are still not legal contracts, but they could be smart contracts that still get executed somehow.
I agree with you. So in those cases, it seems that you have this operational framework that consists of different pieces. At least that's what I'm gauging that you're saying. And if you have precisely defined requirements that are, if you don't meet these, this is the consequence, that is a fruitful material for it to become a smart legal contract where you can just streamline those processes so that these suppliers don't, after 3 months, don't wonder what went wrong and why the penalty was invoked or it was not. But in any case, contract simplification, and when I say contract simplification, I mean just finding a way to present contracts so they are easily understandable and that you can manage them more effectively is closely tied to coding particular clauses or transforming a whole contract into a smart contract, because it will just make that translation bit that I mentioned earlier more effective and more streamlined. That's kind of the reason for that. But yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think everybody can benefit from that. Maybe what will come out of this is if lawyers have to explain contracts in a way that programmers can understand, then all of the rest of us will be able to understand them better too.
Yes, exactly. And as a lawyer, I have to say, I mean, legal lawyers they speak a particular language that is not, we need to learn how to communicate with the rest of the world so they can understand. And I absolutely agree with you. And that is one of the key transformative changes that I see that this will bring, because it really forces us to rethink how we explain and approach these legal. Not all of them, but vast majority of them, I would say.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, Bill. And I also have Tim Stern. Tim had a question also for you.
Okay.
Hey, Tim.
Hi,
Hi.
Bob. Thanks. I'm sorry. What is your name again?
My
Nevena.
name is Nevena. Yes.
Oh, well.
You pronounce that Nevada, is it?
Nevena. There's an N, not an E.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming on to talk. I just wanted to make sure I pronounced your name correctly. Thank you. I don't know if you saw my comments out there, but Bob and I presented last year at DMC on this whole subject of how to, in the pharmaceutical industry, we have, not surprisingly, contracts, as you would expect. But there's a whole operational aspect of them that is rather lengthy, but I'll just boil it down to essentially a third party, like a group purchasing organization, or even the federal government's 340B program, contracts a certain price according to whatever is established or agreed to. And a wholesale distributor is kind of the, if you'll pardon the expression, the middleman, a middle person that buys the product from the manufacturer, but then has to turn around and honor that contracted price to the dispenser, the dispensing pharmacy, what have you, in various classes of trade. But then you mentioned this whole notion of trying to simplify the contracts. I don't know to what degree that would have to happen. I guess in my mind, having an IT background, I would hope that at least that blockchain development tools are as equally as sophisticated as most backend systems are that have been honed and programmed over the years to be able to manage contracts and chargebacks in the pharmaceutical industry. I guess the one wild card that we're still trying to sort out that might throw a monkey wrench into one day, and I emphasize that, one day, really starting to take a serious look at contracts and chargebacks on the blockchain, as Bob and I kind of touched on last year, is there's a lot of disagreement in industry over class of trade, and since that seems to be the one sticking point in my mind that it needs to get resolved for something like this to be a success. What do you think of that?
So thank you for the question. Could you briefly elaborate what you mean by class of trades, just so I understand what the back end of the question is, so I can
the
explain.
business problem, whereas it is where one entity thinks of a hospital or a certain part of the hospital in another way, and another aspect of it is some might argue that something that's acute care can be both inside the hospital as well as outpatient, and others might not. It's really kind of a way of describing healthcare entities, and then as such, under what contracts those classes of trade are what classes of trade, in other words, are applicable under those given contracts. And the fact that there's, I mean, just to put it, just to kind of set the an understanding for it, there's some companies out there that have as many as a few hundred classes of trade. There's other organizations like IMS that consider the industry, across the industry, 140. And then, of course, you've got the group purchasing organizations that have their class of trade, and a manufacturer, for example, has a different one. So,
I understand. Okay, so I see why. Thank you for the clarification, and I see how these different understandings are a challenge and an obstacle. So, how that will. It depends, I guess. I'll try to answer the question to the best of my abilities. It depends if you want. What is it that what is it that you want to create? If and it comes down kind of to this idea of how will the blockchain or smart contracts, whether they will just be restatement of what we're doing now, just in a digital context, in a coded context, or will we see these changes coming in terms of that convergence, or bringing these different understandings and agreeing on what particular terms or elements of different, and I don't think this is just this is a case just in terms of pharmaceutical industry. I think a lot of industries face the same challenge, and that is how do we define these terms that are essential to our contract relationship. So in that sense, if you look at smart contracts and blockchain being something that will just, allow us to do what we are doing now in a more effective way, then, there's I don't see any obstacle in just redoing these contracts or translating these contracts in that environment. However, if you want to create something that is more functional or more of a common market, if you will, that will require a pre-step where you have to agree. You would have to kind of agree how to reconcile these different understandings, because without those, I do not think that a smart contract or blockchain would be possible. So I think, it all comes down to, from my perspective, at least as someone who is not in pharmaceutical industry, it all would come down to what would be the ultimate purpose and the role of smart contracts and blockchain in that industry. And I can see how that is a challenge, and unfortunately do not have a magic wand solution for you.
Yeah, right. The question, of course, is does it go to just is blockchain and smart contracts intended primarily for the bid solicitation and award cycle, where the parties go back and forth and finally hammer out an agreement, and then everything starts running in their systems. Oh, pardon me. Or does it also extend beyond that to the operational part of this, where as product is moving and sales are made, that's when those sales are supposed to be against a certain contract and a contract price, and then
So from my perspective, when you look at, I think that the potential in smart legal contract is almost limitless. I see that, as the idea is of coding contracts and intertwining or connecting terms of contract with performance and so forth, will develop in a way that it will meet the needs of these complex relationships that you and other guests have mentioned. So what will the role of blockchain as such be in that sphere, we'll see. But when we talk about just purely coding those and creating these systems to manage these different contracts, I see again limitless opportunities in those. So I wouldn't narrow it down to just one particular purpose. So yeah, that would be my comment to that one.
Yeah, the only thing, and I'll close here. But this is just really exciting stuff. My IT background kind of keeps drawing me back to the stuff that Bob's working on. That maybe the industry, to get its feet wet, looks at this from the side of between manufacturers and distributors. There's all of these performance-based metrics agreements for, are you meeting my service levels? Are you missing any sales of my product? Is my product rotating over in at the adequate throttle setting, if you will, in your DC? Maybe that's something to kind of get our feet wet in blockchain there, as opposed to the aspects of contracts and chargebacks. Just a thought. Thank you for speaking.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comment. Yeah, thank you.
So, Nevena, you had brought up something earlier, and it was around can we encode intent? We had talked about this, I think, on Wednesday or so.
Yes.
is that a tough one? But essentially, when you look at a regular legal contract, it often says the parties, and they actually even use the word, we intend to share information or do whatever. And that's a quick sentence to put in there, and it implies something that they would like to do. Is that possible to code that or to imply that?
So going to answer that question based on my understanding of what what a contract is. So
Sure.
from a contract is it's manifestation of parties' intent, right? Even they don't have to use the word "we intend to do something" and so forth. They can. It's a matter of contract drafting. But in its essence, contract exists so that parties have a record, if you will, of their intent, of what that contract, what is the goal and purpose of that contract, and how they're going to achieve those interests, so the interests of both sides are met, but at the same time that no party, that everything goes smoothly. So if you look at a contract from that perspective, and if you just code the clauses in a contract, then yes, it is a record of parties' intent in a piece of code. And from my perspective, with that understanding, I would say yes. And that brings us back to that simplification. With contract simplification, I mean making sure that contract terms are clear, concise, and precise. Essentially, so that you can then effectively translate them into code. Now, of course, often this is easier said than done. More complex the contract and relationship around it is more difficult, more challenging it becomes to get to that level of simplification. And I appreciate that it requires a strategic approach to that, and really rethinking the different elements of the complex relationship that some of your guests mentioned. But that does not mean that it is not something that we should think about. And now, and at least as a first step, again, the contract simplification is something that is definitely possible at this stage.
Okay, very good. Well, okay. We're hitting the top of our hour, and Nevena, I just really want to thank you for being on. This is, as Tim put it, this is very exciting. I mean, we've had 3 conversations, and I've left each one of them kind of buzzing a little bit about the possibilities here. Mm-hmm. So I may ask you to come back on and talk again about this, because it's very fascinating. And as companies start to move into these areas and start to experiment with this, they should be really mindful of the legal side of what they're doing.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much again for the invite. This was a great conversation. So thank you. And a huge thanks to all of your guests and for challenging and engaging questions and discussions. This was great fun. Thank you.
Thanks, and have a great night and a great weekend for everyone.
Thank you. You too.